A tourist, believing himself to be above the rules, crossed the line. He stepped over the barrier and tried to touch the sword of a royal guard, confident that he could get away with anything. But the guard's reaction was so swift and powerful that it froze not only the tourist, but the entire crowd in their tracks. What happened next turned that day into a lesson no one would soon forget. Let's start from the very beginning. Morning in London. The city is cloaked in gray skies, with a light drizzle dripping off rooftops and pooling in puddles on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace. It seems like the weather would discourage most people from venturing out, yet the square steadily fills with a persistent crowd of tourists. They stand under umbrellas or pull their hoods tighter, creating a familiar cameras clicking, conversations buzzing, and bursts of laughter here and there. Amid this busy scene, one figure stands apart: James Carter. James, a 32-year-old royal guard, is the embodiment of British monarchy traditions and pride. His tall stature, perfect posture, and crimson uniform adorned with gold buttons make him resemble a statue carved from marble. A white cross belt draped over his shoulder accentuates the precision of his uniform, while the iconic bearskin cap with its polished metal crest hides his sandy blonde hair. His face radiates calm, and his gaze is fixed straight ahead, as if the bustling crowd doesn't exist. Even the tiny raindrops trickling down his uniform fail to disturb his majestic appearance. But not everyone is capable of appreciating tradition. At the center of the crowd stands Carl, a middle-aged American tourist. His bright yellow raincoat struggles to keep him dry, and his booming voice easily drowns out the ambient noise around him. "Hey, buddy!" Carl yells, waving his arms. "Show us your sword. It's just for decoration, right?" His laughter rolls out like thunder, and part of the crowd, those eager for free entertainment, joins in with chuckles. Others exchange awkward glances, but no one steps in to stop Carl. He assumes he's entitled to act however he wants. After all, he's a tourist, and to him the palace and its guards are merely props in a personal show. James, of course, does not react. His stance remains unshaken, his gaze unwavering. It's as though the man shouting at him doesn't exist. For most people, this unflinching composure would serve as a deterrent, but not for Carl. Emboldened by the laughter of a few onlookers, he decides that the guard must acknowledge him, and so Carl steps over the barrier. The crowd collectively gasps, the sharp sound of their reaction cutting through the drizzle. For a brief moment, silence falls over the square. Everyone understands what has just happened. Carl has crossed an invisible boundary, one that separates the world of discipline and tradition from casual curiosity. But Carl? He doesn't care. "Oh, come on," he says, grinning at the stunned onlookers. "It's just a job, nothing special." His steps bring him closer to James. The light drizzle adds an unexpected drama to the scene, the water reflecting off the guard's impeccably polished boots. The crowd starts whispering, and phones are pulled out to record what's happening. Yet James remains still, his uniform flawless, his face unreadable. Seriously? Does this guy think he's in some kind of amusement park? The narrator wonders. Who even does this? It's outrageous. We all know the Royal Guard isn't here for entertainment, but this tourist? Clearly he didn't get the memo. Carl, basking in the crowd's attention, takes another step forward. His face glows with confidence, convinced that something spectacular is about to happen. But no one is laughing now. Even those who chuckled earlier now look uneasy. James remains silent, and that silence is louder than any words could be. It begins to unsettle even Carl, though his pride prevents him from backing down. He believes he has rights, the right to a reaction, the right to a show, the right to be the center of attention. The murmurs of the crowd die down, leaving an oppressive tension hanging in the air. The light rain now feels like part of a stage set, heightening the drama of the moment. Everyone holds their breath, waiting to see what will happen next. Carl, pleased with his own boldness, stepped even closer to the guard. His bright yellow raincoat, damp from the steady drizzle, stood out like a glaring splotch against the gray day. The crowd began to stir. Some whispered nervously among themselves, while others raised their phones, eager to capture the unfolding scene. James Carter, still as a statue, maintained his impeccable posture and focused gaze as though nothing was happening. "Come on, man, are you made of iron or what?" Carl laughed, his voice louder than most people would have found comfortable. "Let me see your sword. It's just for decoration, isn't it?" Step by step, Carl inched closer. His hand reached out toward the gleaming ceremonial blade that the guard held with perfect discipline. The crowd froze. Carl, clearly enjoying the attention, raised his voice even further. "Oh, relax. I just want a closer look." As his hand came within inches of the sword, James moved. The motion was sharp, deliberate, and faster than anyone expected. Like a bolt of lightning, James shifted the sword just out of Carl's reach without breaking his stance, and then he spoke. "Sir, step back behind the line immediately." The voice was low, but carried powerfully across the square. The commanding tone reverberated through the air, silencing the crowd and even muting the sound of the falling rain. The crowd collectively gasped. The moment was electric. Even the drizzle seemed to pause as all eyes remained glued to the scene. Carl froze for a moment, startled by the sudden movement and the tone of authority in the guard's voice. His hand dropped to his side, and for a brief second, he looked unsure of himself. But it didn't last long. Regaining his composure, or at least pretending to, Carl forced a grin and raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, take it easy, buddy. I was just curious," he said with a laugh, though there was an unmistakable note of hesitation in his voice now. The crowd began to divide. Some chuckled nervously, offering Carl faint smiles of encouragement, while others looked on with open disapproval. From somewhere near the back of the gathering, a woman's voice rang out, clear and firm. "That's a symbol of our culture. How can you behave like this?" Carl turned toward the source of the voice. For a moment, his grin faltered, but he quickly recovered, smirking as if to downplay her remark. "A symbol? Come on, I'm a tourist. What's the harm in getting a closer look?" he replied, taking another step forward as if daring someone to challenge him. James Carter remained motionless. His sword was steady, seemingly an extension of himself. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, and didn't say another word. But the silent power in his stance was undeniable, speaking louder than any reprimand ever could. Carl, misinterpreting the guard's silence as permission to continue, grew bolder. "What? You're not going to say anything else? Come on, you can't just stand there all day," he taunted, his laugh now carrying an edge of forced bravado. The crowd murmured louder, their whispers now tinged with concern. "This guy's really crossing the line. He's embarrassing himself." Carl tried to laugh again, but the sound came out hollow and flat. The rain intensified, its steady rhythm against the cobblestones adding a dramatic weight to the moment. The atmosphere became thick, almost oppressive, like the air before a thunderstorm. The crowd collectively held its breath. Everyone knew something was about to happen. The crowd, frozen after Carl's antics, suddenly came to life at the sharp sound of a child's cry from the other side of the barrier. Heads turned in unison. A little girl, no older than 6, wearing a bright pink raincoat, had stumbled and fallen just beyond the safety line. Her small hands trembled as she struggled to push herself up on the wet cobblestones. Her tear-streaked face crumpled in pain and fear. But the real danger lay nearby. She had fallen far too close to the guard's horse. The massive animal began shifting uneasily, its hooves clattering against the slippery stones. It could sense the commotion, its instincts kicking in as its movements grew restless and unpredictable. The rain intensified, the rhythmic patter against the ground and the metallic barriers growing louder. The atmosphere, already tense, shifted to one of genuine alarm. Voices from the crowd erupted, sharp and anxious. "Someone! Help her! She's too close to the horse!" Carl, who had been basking in the attention just moments earlier, stood frozen. His self-assured grin had vanished, replaced by an expression of confusion and unease. For the first time he seemed unsure of himself, his bravado stripped away. But the crowd no longer paid him any attention. All eyes were now fixed on the little girl and the guard. James Carter, breaking the stillness he had maintained throughout the morning, took his first step forward. His movements were precise and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing around him. The crowd fell silent, watching intently as he approached. His face remained composed, his every step exuding control and assurance, and when he finally spoke, his voice, calm yet commanding, carried clearly through the rain. "Stay calm, little one. Everything is under control." The words were steady and measured, their soothing tone directed not just at the girl, but at the agitated horse as well. The animal, which had been shifting its weight nervously, began to relax. Its hooves, once clattering, slowed to a still. James continued forward, his movements deliberate and careful. Reaching the girl, he knelt down beside her, meeting her frightened gaze with steady confidence. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said softly. With practiced ease, he scooped her up into his arms. The child, still trembling, clung tightly to him, her sobs gradually quieting as she buried her face in the crimson of his uniform. The crowd held its breath as James carried her back across the barrier. Her parents rushed forward, their faces pale with worry and relief. Thank you so much," her mother exclaimed, clutching the girl tightly. "She's safe now," James replied, his voice calm and professional. The square erupted into applause. Cheers and whistles filled the air as the onlookers, many of whom had been recording the moment, shouted their admiration. "A real hero. That's what tradition looks like in action." The girl's parents, overwhelmed with emotion, thanked James again, tears streaming down their faces. But James, ever the professional, simply nodded and turned back to his post. His movements were just as precise as before, his steps steady, his expression returning to its usual stoic calm. Yet, if one looked closely, a faint glimmer of kindness could be seen in his eyes, a subtle reflection of the humanity behind the uniform. Carl, witnessing the entire event, felt his confidence drain away completely. The smugness that had lit up his face moments ago had been replaced by embarrassment. He shifted uncomfortably, trying not to meet the eyes of the crowd, who were now glancing at him with a mixture of scorn and disdain. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. "That's who really doesn't belong here. Maybe he should learn a thing or two about respect." Carl lowered his gaze, taking a hesitant step back. Then another. He was clearly desperate to blend into the crowd, to fade from view, but it was impossible. No longer the bold provocateur, Carl now appeared small and pitiful, just another fool outshone by the quiet dignity of the guard. The rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt significant. The square, so recently filled with tension, began to settle once more. Yet the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something far greater than the usual spectacle of the changing of the guard. This was a lesson in honor and humility, one that would not be forgotten anytime soon. James Carter calmly returned to his post. His steps were measured and purposeful, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. With precision, he adjusted his uniform, raised his ceremonial sword back into its proper position, and resumed his unyielding stance. Beside him, the horse, which had been restless moments earlier, now shifted quietly on its hooves, sensing that its rider was once again in control. The crowd stood in silence, as if collectively trying to process everything they had just witnessed. The tension that had hung so heavily in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of admiration. Then, breaking the silence, an elderly woman in a light blue coat spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "Now that's a real hero, not the ones who just stand around making jokes." Her words hit the crowd like a bolt of lightning, prompting an immediate reaction. A murmur of agreement swept through the onlookers, followed by applause. "Well said. What an example for everyone." The applause grew louder, and a few voices called out, "Way to go! This is what true dignity looks like." Carl, who had been standing awkwardly in place, flinched at the attention. His face flushed a deep red, and he avoided looking at anyone around him. Slowly, as if hoping no one would notice, he tried to slip away. But the crowd wasn't ready to let him off so easily. From somewhere in the throng, a voice rang out. "It's all over the internet now, buddy. Ready to be famous?" The crowd erupted into laughter. Not the kind of laughter Carl had enjoyed earlier, but a sharp, mocking sound that made him quicken his pace. His earlier confidence had completely dissolved, and now he looked like nothing more than a man desperate to disappear. Phones were aimed at him as he hurried away, capturing every moment of his retreat. What had begun as a spectacle of arrogance had ended as a public display of humiliation. Meanwhile, James Carter stood as still as ever, his posture impeccable, his face a mask of professional calm. To anyone glancing his way, it would seem as though nothing had happened at all. He had resumed his role as the immovable symbol of discipline and tradition. But for those who had been there, the moment had been unforgettable. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, conversations bubbled with admiration for James. That's what the Royal Guard stands for. He didn't just do his job, he showed us what real honor looks like. Toward the edge of the square, a young man turned to his friend and said softly, "That's the kind of person who should be a role model, a true symbol of dignity." In the meantime, videos of the incident had begun to circulate online. Social media buzzed with reactions. Many praised James for his unwavering composure and humanity, while others condemned Carl for his arrogance and lack of respect. The comments reflected a clear divide. James Carter is the epitome of grace under pressure. Carl deserves every bit of embarrassment he's getting. Disrespectful behavior like that has no place here. As the rain began to ease and the square grew quieter, James remained steadfast at his post. He stood tall, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if none of the day's events had even occurred. But for everyone who had been there, the memory of the moment lingered. It was a reminder of the importance of respect. Respect for tradition, for culture, and for the people who dedicate themselves to preserving it. The square gradually emptied, the tourists disappearing into the London streets. Yet the sense of order and majesty James had restored hung in the air, a quiet testament to the strength of tradition. James Carter, unmoving and dignified, remained where he was, a silent symbol of discipline, honor, and the enduring power of tradition. What do you think? Should the Royal Guards have to endure such provocations? Or did Carl get the punishment he deserved? Opinions may vary, but one thing is certain. Honor and tradition will always outweigh any insult.